Welcome to NCAER. I'm Sonalde Desai, a professor at NCER and Center Director for National Data Innovation Center. I'm also hold an appointment at University of Maryland. This is the first event organized by NCER's new Gender Data Hub, where we hope to bring data and evidence to bear on public policy with respect to women, men, gender. My colleague Pallavi Choudhuri is sitting next to me, and I are spearheading this effort. But this hub is meant to be for all of us interested in issues related to gender and data, a place to think about data, to debate it, to use the data that NCER collects as well as data that's collected publicly. So for those of you who would like to collaborate with us or participate in NCER's Gender Data Hub, please do get in touch. It's very easy to say we need to get better data, more data to bear on public policies. The problem is that when it comes to gender, there are a variety of questions that are not very clear. What kind of data do we need? Does the data that we need really exist, or do we need to collect something differently? People who need to use the data, do they have actually access to it? Given the world in which we live, where there are a lot of data gatekeepers, do feminist activists and people interested in gender-related policies have access to these data? These are the kinds of questions that we hope to debate in today's panel. Today's panelists are an outstanding group. I don't think we could have found better people to talk about some of these issues. Let me introduce them. Then I have asked each of the panelists to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes to give their perspective on some of these topics. After that, we will begin with sort of discussion and debate within and between panelists, as well as questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A box. So our first speaker today is Rukmini S. Rukmini is one of India's foremost data journalists who began doing data journalism way before the term was even known. She has worked at Times of India, Hindu, Mint, Huffington Post, but today she is here in her avatar as author with her new book, which we are all very excited about, Whole Numbers and Half Truths. So I hope Rukmini will talk a little bit about how easy or difficult it was to get the data that she wanted and needed. Where should we be going as we sort of think about future data ecosystem associated with issues related to gender? Our second speaker today will be Diva Dhar. Diva is the Deputy Director for Data and Evidence for Women's Economic Empowerment at the Gates Foundation. Diva has done a lot of research on gender norms and its impact on women's lives. In her current position, she's also debating how do we get the kind of data we need to evaluate public policies that are of relevance? Who collects the data? Who gets access to it? More importantly, how does it get used? Our third speaker is Mayra Buvinic. Mayra is an internationally recognized expert on gender and development. She was the founding member and president of International Center for Research on Women, followed by a position at the Inter-American Development Bank, where she headed the Social Development Division, and a position as Director for Gender and Development at the World Bank. Mayra has worked very hard to ensure that gender is located within the core of development discourse and not ghettoized in separate locations. In her current work, she is with United Nations Foundation and Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C., where she was a founding member of an initiative called Data 2X, designed to ensure that the importance of gender data is recognized and gender data systems are adequately funded. Our final speaker is Jeemol Unni. Jeemol serves on the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics constituted by the Government of India. Before joining Ahmedabad University as a professor of economics, she was the director of Institute for Rural Management in Anand. Jeemol has a long history of traversing between research and advocacy. She has worked extensively with SEBA and Viago, organizations devoted to recognizing, valuing, and supporting women and informal workers. There are very few people in the world who have the kind of experience bridging official statistics, feminist advocacy, and academic research like Jeemol. Last but not the least, I want to introduce my colleague, Pallavi Choudhuri, my partner in crime in developing this gender data hub, who has worked extensively on women's unpaid work. So without further ado, let me turn to Rukmini for her opening remarks. We will have all four speakers speak one after another. And after that, we'll get to the question answer session. So please make sure to put your questions in the chat box. It will also help if you can identify the speaker to whom these questions are addressed. And Pallavi and I will field the questions to appropriate speakers. So Rukmini, the first thing I wanted to ask you was, please feel free to speak about whatever you want to speak about. But I was really struck by your book, which dealt with the issues surrounding public and private lives of women in India. Some of the statistics that you use came from official sources. Some of them came from private data. How well do you feel that official statistics provided the kind of data that you needed? What kind of topics on which we still need to collect data?
Thank you for this. I just want to begin with the acknowledgement that, even my presence over here in Delhi required my mother-in-law to pick up my son from school. My mother is currently full-time caregiver to an unwell member of family, and a good part of this book got written because my best friend flew into Chennai and babysat my children. So, my very presence over here is on account and, as a privilege of so much of women's unpaid work. As you say, the book tries to answer 10 big questions about how things work in modern India by looking at what good data can tell us about these questions, as well as what the data misses. And in the course of attempting to answer these questions, I considered a variety of official and unofficial sources, official and private sources. The overarching theme that really struck me about the presence of women in data is that official data in particular does a good job of capturing binaries and things that are more in black and white, while the lives of women in particular and marginalized groups in general tend to exist in a space that is of much greater impermanence. And that is the space that I think data struggles to capture. This exists, for example, when you talk of migration. I think official statistics do a good job of capturing permanent migration in India, but do a much poorer job of capturing the sort of seasonal and circular migration that, as the IHDS data shows us, marginalized people are highly overrepresented in that data. Similarly, I think official data does a good job of capturing whether someone is employed or unemployed. And it's likely that this does a better job of capturing male realities, while the work of people like you and Ashwini Deshpande has shown that perhaps women's work exists in spaces that are much harder to capture through official data. So one of the sort of pleas that I try to make through the book, and that I'd love to repeat here, is that I seek much greater creativity in the asking of questions, creativity that necessarily acknowledges this state of impermanence that many women exist in. In considering the data sources that I looked at, there are many official data sources as well that do a good job of capturing women's realities. And I think election and voting data is one of the sort of relative success stories. We do a good job of capturing women electors, women voters, and as good a job of capturing women's motivations as we do of capturing men's motivations, which is to say, not a terribly good job, but perhaps as bad for both men and women. And again, here, I think the problem lies in not in questions that have been set long in the past, and a sort of ossification of questionnaires without deep thinking around it. In terms of data sets that do not do a good job of capturing women, I think access to health has really proved to be one of the areas that women are absent in important sources of the data, and this came to have very real world implications in the last 2 years in the pandemic. Since we know from older data that women are less likely to be able to access health, we know this from the IHDS, for example. This was really an area that should have been front of mind in the last 2 years, and I think that isn't something that happened. And perhaps there is, some element of a silent epidemic of, uncaptured COVID among women that perhaps a separate study is needed for. I think similarly, the fact that we know historically that women are underrepresented in death registration and death certification should have also been something that we should have been talking more about in the last 2 years. And then there's, I think, a third category, which is neither excluding nor including, but perhaps misleading. And I think crime statistics in particular fall into this category. In the book, I deal through a chapter with all the problems that I have found in how police statistics in particular capture crimes against women, which I think do a true disservice to our understanding of both sexual autonomy as well as sexual crime. And finally, the inferences around safety and women's agency that we draw from these become complicated. So what, my sort of way of looking ahead would be, one is to try and think about greater creativity in questions. And with this, I feel, I think the sort of overarching theme is the question of, what if you had options? Because in repeated data sets, I find that we stop at the answers without asking the question, but what if this was not where you had to be? So for example, with the NSSO, we know that many women say that they are not in the paid workforce, either working or looking for work because they are attending to childcare. And I wish there was a way for perhaps not the NSSO, but someone else to ask, what if you didn't have to do this? What if someone could take care of it? And that, would be a way of taking the conversation forward as well. I also think that, that there is perhaps a sort of stepping back that we need to take around the question of women's labor force participation, and perhaps come with fresh questions. Because I do think that the question of social norms remains essential, and perhaps there needs to be new ways of thinking about how we can approach the issue of the question of social norms better. I just wanted to leave you with one sort of story from the book, which I feel, does a good job of capturing complicated questions. And I talk quite a lot in the book about issues around love and marriage, and this is something that IGTS does a good job of capturing, and I wish to see more of it going forward. And I looked at one particular relationship when I'm talking about how few intercaste marriages we see in India. And I spoke to a young woman called Manisha Mondal, who said she always thought that she would have a love marriage. She said, I was used to fighting with my parents. I fought to study commerce instead of arts. I fought to go to a college that was a little far away from home. I thought, okay, love marriage will be the next thing to fight about. She's an office assistant in Bhilai. But as soon as she reached college, social norms kicked in, and her friends and seniors in college, warned her that her reputation would be besmirched if she was seen talking to boys in college. And her brother also kept a very sort of close eye on her. So she gave in a sense, to an arranged marriage. And she said to me, that of all the things she wanted to fight about, college was most important to her. So she decided that this was one fight she was not going to have, and she was going to give in to an arranged marriage. So perhaps when we ask the question about intercaste marriage, if there was a what if that we could ask there, that what if you didn't face these things, or what if there wasn't a limited number of fights you could have, what were the decisions you could take? I'll just end there. I'd love to hear from the other speakers now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rukmini. It's a fascinating book. I urge all of you to read it. It has a number of stories that are presented in a very engaging manner that sort of somehow brings the data alive to us. Okay. Our next speaker is Diva Dhar. Okay. Diva, feminist advocacy has always found it challenging to decide between setting up gender as a separate vertical in the data and evidence ecosystem versus having it sort of incorporated within it. You are working extensively with gender-specific data and evidence ecosystem. How do you find sort of dealing with sort of broad policy initiatives and just give us your sense on where some of the challenges are. You don't have to answer my question, focus on whatever makes sense to you, but I'm really curious about this whole idea of gender data as being separate versus integrated into sort of other systems. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonal. I think it's a very interesting question and one that we discuss and debate a lot in terms of approaches. I do think that gender data is the bedrock of effective and inclusive policy making, but there are different views on how to go about addressing it. And I think there are also a huge difference in how we think about it in theory and in practice in terms of how things actually happen on the ground. In theory, by nature, gender data is intersectional and it sort of permeates all aspects of the data system, whether it's, as Rukmini was saying, whether it's crime data or data around work, around how we think, how we eat. It's really a part of various aspects of the data ecosystem. But in reality, there's a lot of tension in terms of how data around women's lives is actually prioritized or taken into account. So you don't often find that gender comes into play at various stages, whether it's planning or conceptualizing, the analysis, dissemination, and use, and it leads to this very sort of skewed or not uniform distribution of how gender is captured in various aspects of the data ecosystem, and it's often therefore treated as this like add-on or special interest topic. To give you an example, when the pandemic hit, and there was a lot of discussion around data that was and was not available, whether on health and economics. A response that we often got from those who were collecting data was, we are disaggregating data by sex in terms of respondents. But the question is, this kind of gender neutral approach can often actually be a gender blind approach. If you're not potentially capturing areas where women are disproportionately disadvantaged or affected, whether it's care work, as Rukmini mentioned as well, whether it's gender-based violence, whether it's mental health, then I think there ends up being a large part of women's realities that are not captured. And similarly, I think in terms of representation, I think if there isn't an intentional at the outset effort to capture marginalized groups, whether it's women and other minorities, I think that you do see these kinds of underrepresentation. And so it requires these exercises which are additive rather than foundational to the work that's happening around data ecosystems. And so I think the way to address this from where we have been working and a number of our partners, some of whom are here today, including you, has been this dual approach where it's to layer gender into the data ecosystem, whether it's institutionalizing gender into statistical guidelines in national statistical offices, ensuring that women are represented. Women from grassroots organizations and movements are actually part of gender statistics committees in NSOs, or that there is discussion around how this data is going to be used. So that's one branch of effort. Women Count, for example, a partner of ours, and related to the topic of we're talking about Women Counted, is taking this approach as well with national statistical offices. Having said that, there's also work on doing things that haven't been done before. So only 70 countries or 80 countries have actually ever collected data on time use. So it requires this kind of additive effort to build in GBV modules into the DHS, or do GBV surveys, do time use surveys, do work that is going to be additive. while at the same time building guidance around things like household surveys or labor force surveys on how to capture women's realities of work, asset ownership, and many other fields. And I think this becomes important because otherwise we end up discussing so many different topics, whether it's, let's say, cash transfer programs or public works programs or procurement, many things that, gender only ends up being an issue of what is the gender of the recipient and not actually looking at the program from design to uptake. And I think this sort of conceptualization and inclusion of gender is going to be key, not just to programs that are only targeting women, but to sort of our broader reality of how we think about public policy programs. And just to say, I think, lastly, just to end on that, Rukmini asked some really interesting what if questions. What if women had childcare? What if flexible work was actually available? And I think the approach that we are trying in a lot of these cases is to actually do experiments to understand the what if. So, create evaluations of test solutions. So what if you have subsidized childcare or access to creches or leave policies? What if your employer provides childcare? What are the kinds of impacts you see if we actually evaluate these what ifs?
Thank you, Diva. I was just saying that listening to you, I was thinking that one of the biggest challenges that I faced as a working mother was all around the way the cities had grown and the amount of commuting that was involved, which actually made a tremendous difference to the way I was able to structure my work and family life. And these are the kinds of things that don't always get sort of incorporated into our thinking, nor do things like street lights, public safety measures for women, and so on. I'd like to turn now to our third speaker, Mayra Buvinic. Mayra, in your diverse roles, you have dealt with both collection of data as well as use of the data for policy making. Can you give us some examples of the ways in which feminist insights have been used in thinking around economic development and public policies? Do you feel that, what are the kind of role that international coalitions like Data 2X can play in shaping the data ecosystem around gender?
Sure. Hi, and hi to everybody. So lovely to see you all, except it's virtual. But let me congratulate NCAER on setting up the Gender Data Hub. I've always admired the work that you guys do, but it's really wonderful that now you're going to focus on a Gender Data Hub as well. I will start by saying sort of three areas where I think that feminist insights have really reshaped data collection and reframed policy debates. And the first one is what Rukmini and Diva have already mentioned, which is counting unpaid household and care work. But today is International Women's Day, and I've been sort of looking back to the decades that we have been working in this area, and I found a sentence from a good feminist, a wonderful feminist. He happens to be a man, and it's a sentence from John Kenneth Galbraith in his Economics and Public Purpose book in 1973. And he says, the modern economic system has relegated women to the menial service of managing the possession and consumption of goods with no economic compensation. Since compensation is not economic, it is not valued in national income, and what is not counted is often not noticed. So I think that feminists advocating for counting particularly unpaid care and household work and valuing it in national income has brought out, and what Rukmini have said, but it has brought out the importance of the care economy, and that the bulk of the work in the care economy is done by women. And I think that this has become more relevant than ever. And finally, has come to become a very visible issue with the COVID pandemic. And I think that, you know, the policy debates nowadays in all around the globe for setting reliable childcare and elder care services, I think owe it to the way that feminists have conceptualized, you know, the importance of measuring this unpaid work. Second, you know, sort of feminists have also done advocating for better data on women's paid work and contributions, which we have already said. And, you know, there are data gaps and there's bad gender data. And the bad gender data, I think, is much more serious than having a gender data gap, because then public policy is based on bad data. And I think, you know, here's where official statistics have systematically misrepresented reality in such a way to make women appear to be more dependent and less productive than they are. The default in household rosters is the man as head of the household. Until recently, labor force participation data have undercounted women's work in farms and firms in the informal sector in self-employment. I think feminists have led the way in correcting the way questions have been generated. And this has really led to shifts in the provision of productive services. And this is, I think, particularly the case now if we look at the development assistance agencies that, you know, now are finally providing productive services like agricultural inputs to thinking that women are partly clients of those services. There's still, though, a way to go here. And I think, you know, we have been working a lot in terms of financial services. And, you know, there's still a big gap in women's access to financial services. And there, particularly on the supply side of financial services, data is usually not sex disaggregated. And more importantly, we have been seeing that even when banks and financial services providers collect the data sex disaggregated, they don't use it. So, and then therefore, you know, financial products are not designed with women clients in mind. And, you know, probably there is sort of an unconscious biases in not only in the design of financial services, but in the provision of financial services for women. And, you know, sex disaggregation of this data and using this data for designing financial services products and for monitoring, for banks, for more than monitoring the portfolio will really, I think, make a significant change in terms of women's access to these services. And third, you know, and very importantly, is debunking the notion that households function as a unit with no conflicts within it. I think that feminists looking into breaking down the households and recording what happens to individuals by gender, mostly inequalities in the allocation of household resources and gender differences in preferences have really shaped a lot of public policy. And particularly, I mean, you know, not only sort of on the side of inequalities, but in terms of preferences, the finding that women prefer to spend meager resources in poor households on children's welfare has led really since the 1990s to designing conditional cash transfer programs with women in mind and giving mothers the money of the cash transfer. I think that this was, you know, first launched with Progress in Mexico in 1997, and it really, I mean, has influenced the way the social protection programs have been designed throughout the world. And this has been tremendously important, I think, particularly now with the pandemic and the response to, you know, increased social protections. So this is, again, a critical area where feminist thinking has influenced the way that the questions have been done, the data has been collected, and programs have been designed. how about I leave the second issue of sort of what data collectives can do for further down the line in questioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayra. Listening to you, I was just remembering all the years I have known you as an activist around gender and inclusion of gender issues within the development discourse. And the two things that you highlighted have really struck me right now. One is the research that the feminist scholars have done, which has sort of highlighted the different ways in which men and women think about and address issues of household resource allocation and what it implies for public policy. And second, the unconscious biases in the public policies, which leave women out simply by not thinking about some of the constraints that women face. So thank you for highlighting those. We now turn to our final panelist, Jeemol Unni. Jeemol, you hold the unique position of having worked with the government data systems, academic institutions, as well as feminist advocacy groups. Okay, what are the challenges that you have seen in incorporation of feminist perspectives in large data collection efforts? Maybe you have some success stories you can tell us.
Thank you, Susan and Pallavi, for asking me to speak at this. And it's really quite a fascinating discussion that we're having on a theme that is my favorite theme, gendering statistics. First, looking at what we've been talking about now, I just like to say that all sources of data are important, and all sources of data tell us something. You can have good data, bad data, but each source of data is collected for a purpose. So you can't ask one particular data source questions which you could ask another particular data source. Number one. Next point I'd like to make is that there's a difference between collecting data, gender data, at a macro aggregate level, which has its own very, very important position, like the population census or the national sample surveys, various rounds, or even the, now we have the NCAER data, but the National Family Health Survey, NFHS. So each of them are asking different sets of questions, and they're giving you aggregate data for a region, a country, and so on. That has its own usefulness. The other kind of data is the micro data, which is collected at, of course, this is also collected at the micro level and then aggregated. But it's done with a statistical frame which allows you to make estimates for the region as a whole or the country as a whole, which has its importance. The other kind of data is what Rukmini has been talking about. That it is looking at micro data collected in the field from looking at particular issues of the individual, of the household, and I'm not going to tell you what kind of issues. It includes domestic violence and things like that. Domestic violence data is quite an interesting questions asked in the national NFHS data as well. So I will not say that any data source is good, bad, or ugly. Each of them has a role to play in our overall understanding of any gender issue that we're talking about. That's my first point. The other thing is, how does one influence data collection? Now, data collection, what do you want to influence? Obviously, it is the national data, because if you're collecting your own data, nobody's stopping you in this country from collecting whatever data you want to do. Hopefully, you have a good statistical, sampling frames and so on to do that, to be able to say anything from that data. But what is it that we want in terms of influencing national statistical systems or very large data set collections which are happening, like NCAER is collecting, or now the recent one is the private sources like CMI data, which has become quite popular because of the fact that they are collecting employment data on a monthly basis, and so on. So in order to do that, I will also explain like Sonal just said about a success story. I had this great opportunity to work with. So I call it, the coming together of a Trimurti. If you want to influence national statistics, you need somebody who's going to ask those questions. And those questions are generally the civil society that asks. Of course, academics also ask this question, or civil society, embellished with the academics who are able to then take it forward. And then you need the statistical agencies, which will, somebody who is listening to you and is willing to figure out that, okay, this is making sense. So we had that one unique opportunity around the mid or late 1990s when Self-Employed Women's Association, which is basically ELABEL, had asked this question of what is the size and contribution of the informal sector. And we were able to put together, and then academics like me and NCAER, people in NCAER came forward to help with this statistics. And it so happened that at that point in time, we had people in the Ministry of Statistics who were, were interested to listen to this, and they were already been thinking in terms of how to collect data on informal sector. It was also happening at the international level because the ILO was also pushing for this. So we had this unique opportunity to do a survey in Ahmedabad city, and the questionnaire that basically I devised with Silva was taken almost whole hog into the 55th round of the National Sample Surveys Labor Force Survey, which is the 99,000 survey. Now, what were these questions we asked? Because that then you get the nitty-gritty of what it was that. So basically, the question was, how do you identify and measure informal sector's size and contribution? So here, the contribution we're looking at is in terms of employment. We also did it for GDP. We entered questions, simple things like what is the registration of the units? So in order to be able to identify an informal sector unit as compared to a formal sector unit, including the size of employment in the unit. We asked questions regarding social protection benefits being received from the employer, which helps you to identify informal employment. And for the first time, we were able to get data on this concept of informal employment within the formal sector. That is, people who are working in the formal sector but not getting all the benefits. That data then got incorporated those set of. There was another very interesting question on the place of work. So where do you work? So this is idea that everybody has an institution in which they work. We discovered that's absolutely not true. More than 60-70%, particularly of women, work in undesignated places of work, like the home, in the employer's home, on the street, in construction sites, and so on. And so very small proportion of women who actually work in designated sites like me in the university office or in a hospital and so on. So this this question on the place of work was also included into this national sample survey. And the fascinating thing was, while we managed that, it went in, also the ILO was behind it and the statistical office was behind it. There was that, like I said, that Trimurti came together and there was that particular moment when it actually happened. Those questions continued into the next rounds of the labor force survey. Fascinating thing was, later on, there was another set of questions. It was on contract. So do you work for a contract? So the idea was to identify home-based workers and home workers, that is people who are subcontracting in. So you have a series of questions in the labor force survey which asks you, are you taking work on contract? And if you are, what are the terms and conditions of that contract? So fascinating set of questions. Later on, some of them got dropped, because sometimes the statistical officers later on didn't quite understand why we introduced that question there. So we did lose a little bit of the edge over there. But then I found that these set of questions on place of work, on contract, they started getting into other data sources. Like they came out in the informal enterprises survey. They came out in the economic census. So in the economic census, that is the entire census of enterprises in the country as a whole. 2013 was the last, now one is supposed to be going on. You can actually identify the proportion of home-based workers. So, there is some kind of I don't know what it is, that, allowed these questions to float into the other data sources as well. So it was, in that sense, a great contribution. At this point in time, we are again out to, in the Economic Statistics Committee, the Standing Committee on Economics. There's a subcommittee on the Periodic Labor Force Survey and Time Use Surveys, which I happen to chair. And NCAER is a member, Sonal comes in once in a while. So there now we are trying to see whether we can broaden this concept of work and work for women. And there is the concept given to us by the ILO, that is in the 19th ICLS, where they have a much broader concept of work. So we're trying to see whether we can, but let me tell you, it's not easy at all. We are fighting, against like a wall. And, we want to get a pilot survey done. And just to get that pilot survey done, we just don't ask like what the kind of trouble we're having. But the questionnaire has been designed. It's not that it's complete blank. A new questionnaire has been designed. And we hope that we'll be able to push through a pilot survey. And so that we get, I'm not saying it's going to be the best. It's never the best. No data can be best. But yeah, it is possible to influence, provided that, you are, your work allows you to, and you have to get inside. If you don't get inside, it's not. And then what I said, this remotely, there has to be that push from outside, and there has to be this entry inside, which is a very difficult thing because that is, I don't know how that comes about. So I think I'll stop here. There are many other issues that I would like to talk about. The one point that Rukmini made was about falsification of concepts that are used in questionnaires. I agree with that, actually. Even in the labor force survey, we have been struggling. I have been struggling personally to, our labor force survey questionnaires are very different from the international one. We give a lot of emphasis to usual status, which means in 365 days, what was your status? That time frame is gone. We have to look at it on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, because things are changing so rapidly. People are moving so rapidly. We have to get an account of that. So one of our fights today is to give more importance to a weekly status data so that at least we take a shorter reference period and talk, be able to get more data and more questions addressed to that particular reference period rather than this usual status. Usual status was something that was entered in 1972-73 by that Dantwala committee and so on. And I have struggled even in the earlier standing committee on labor force statistics to try and get that out, but it didn't succeed. So it's a struggle. And I'm talking at this point in time only about workforce participation. All the other myriad issues which are there, each of them would require the same kind of thing to get through to official statistics. I think I'll stop now.
Thank you, Jeemol. I actually want to highlight some of the consequences of the work that you mentioned. Okay. The whole idea of recognizing women's home-based work and participation in informal labor force has had tremendous impact on some of the social policies that have been devised since then with respect to things like insurance for home-based workers and so on, which, was otherwise all of our insurances were sort of focused around employer-based insurances. Okay, so I think that there has been a tremendous impact of the work that you have been able to do, and not just you, but the whole collective of feminist scholars who worked very closely together. That's one of the more interesting and inspiring stories about the feminist scholarship around the data activism, that it has been sort of this supportive community that has worked together and worked together very well. So that is something sort of worthwhile for us to take away with. Now, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to Pallavi to, if she has any comments, questions for some of the panelists, and then we will turn to the questions from the audience. So please do put them in the question and answer box. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonal. So my first question is to Mayra. And you talked about cash transfers and social protection measures, keeping in mind women's work, and also how household resources are divided based on who is taking the decision, women or men. Now, my question is with regard to some of your research on women-headed households, like when you, in one of your very famous paper where you have looked at de jure or versus de facto women-headed households. So in the sense that in some cases where you have a senior member senior women-headed household, but she is not really taking the decision. She's just a senior member, versus where you have households like men-headed households, but the woman is actually taking the decision. So what kind of implications this has on women's access to financial resources? And do you think the data system needs to be re-envisioned to make these sorts of distinction? And what implications can this also have on cash transfer programs? My second question is, shall we let her answer the question? Okay, yes, please.
Thank you for the question. That's a difficult question, but I just want to reiterate just what Jeemol just said. These are difficult issues, and sort of statistics will never be perfect. But I think that the issue of women-headed households, and more importantly, the issue of the household roster, and how do you, how do you build a questionnaire if you don't use the household roster, or what kind of assignment then you do? I mean, it really needs rethinking the way that you're going to be collecting data on households. And that is sort of, it's a tough thing to do, but obviously, as you have just said it, Pallavi, it has had tremendous implications for policy. The fact that there has been this biased conceptualization that men are usually the household's heads, and they're still, I mean, questionnaires still, and famous, sort of international survey instruments still have as the default the man as the head of the household. So, that still is, I think, affecting the way that people are seeing women as less productive and more dependent, right? As not economically productive beings. But then, okay, so we need to figure out a way to redo the household questionnaires, perhaps using household rosters, but not asking the question of headship. But then, then the outcome will be, you will have to ask very, very specific questions to different individuals to see their economic contributions to the household, which clearly can be done, and probably it will be a much less biased way of doing things, but this will take more time of household questionnaires, and it will take it will mean that you will have to spend more time doing the questionnaires, and that survey instruments will be more expensive. So I think all these sort of options and alternatives ultimately have to be put through the vision of what is possible, how we can minimize biases, but on the other hand, not ask of interviewees in particular to be spending a lot of time answering questions, and not make household surveys too expensive. Before closing, I want to say the one other thing that I think is terribly important in all survey instruments, and rarely gets done, is giving individuals, both women and men, and whatever, the option of opting out and not answering the question. And that is something that, that is the ethical thing to do, regardless, but that often is not done. So I think, that's another issue. I think that it is very important that from now onwards, that we make sure that we always give the interviewee the option of not answering. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayra. That's a great answer. My next question is to Jeemol, and given her experience with national statistics. So if we look at women's informal sector participation, that has increased over the last decade, and even like if you go beyond that. And But if we compare across, national statistics and surveys such as IHGS, what we see is a huge undercounting of women's work, especially given the fragmented nature of work. So if you think of principal status or subsidiary status, there are definitional issues. Subsidiary status captures only if you have worked on something for 30 days and nothing less. Whereas IHGS shows that a lot of women are working for a lesser number of days, but probably more women are working. But this is not getting captured in official statistics. So can we think of a data structure in official statistics that is able to capture these nuances? And my concern stems from the fact that we are talking of social protection measures, but if this undercounting keeps continuing, then this has implications on gender budgeting of social protection. And so what are your thoughts on that?
So this is a question that is, talked about the most, I think, undercounting of women. So, I mean, like I said, if you're using usual status data, then you are going to undercount. But then if you look at that subsidiary status, the proportion of women who are doing subsidiary status as compared to men, and then even subsidiary status, at least in the earlier rounds, now it's changing. You would be able to get what did they do in their subsidiary status. So there are, ways in which you can arrive at this. The other thing I'd like to say about this is that there are different data sources which are telling you different aspects of employment or about work, right? So one of the things that one needs to do if you're using secondary data is what is called triangulation, in the sense that you have to look at the same phenomenon from different data sources, which is what you people are doing, except that, you say that, okay, IHBS data gets, this participation, and the NSS data doesn't get this kind of participation. If you look at the CMI data source, they tell you something else. It has, of course, to do with the definitions. There isn't any doubt about that. And the definitions are being, have to be improved over a period of time. Now, if you look at the 19th ICLS, which we're trying to push into this NSS thing, I have no clue whether it'll ever happen. They have defined a very broad concept of work. And they have these 5 different categories of work. Out of that, only one is for pay or profit. And then the rest are for own use and for market use. And within that also, to what extent for own use and for market use. So they have these 5 distinct categories. And they also measure. So one of the problems that we have with the statistics, the way it is now, once you know that this person only works for, like Pallavi just said, you work 30 days, or say, let's even in a week. So 1 hour you work. Now, what does that person do for the rest of the time? So the NSS data is not telling us what is that person doing the rest of the time. It's not twiddling that, she's not twiddling her thumbs for sure. So there are a series of questions here with regard to that kind of, what are those activities that they conduct there? And they have a whole lot of, there are a whole lot of definitions of potential labor force and some other unemployment or underemployment categories distinguished. So in this new questionnaire that we've developed, we've tried to enter all those concepts. So I'm not saying that 19th ICLS is the best. I don't even know if it is the best, but it is definitely adding to your understanding of work, so that if you are getting this very, small proportion of people reporting themselves at work, at least you'll get an idea of the rest of the time what they're doing. And then if you have these various categories, then it is left to the researcher to be able to, which is what time use survey does, helps you to do. Then it's left to the researcher to decide which of these activities you want to call work, and not what, the National Sample Survey is saying, this is work, right? So that kind of a set of questions which allows you to see what people are doing with various time use survey. I'm not a great fan of time use survey for the reason that it's extremely expensive. And to get hour-wise records of all the people in the household. So, I mean, it's fantastic, do it. And in fact, the standing committee has come to the thing that every 3 years they're going to do a time use survey. I can tell you that I'm shocked, because the last one was done, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And that too only for 6 states. So there is a lot of improvement, but then of course, that funds are cut, and then, we don't have fund to do this, we don't have fund to do this. And the first thing that you can cut off is obviously this, just like that consumer expenditure survey. We won't talk about that. It's a totally different story. So I have hope that even the national statistics can be improved, but it's a struggle. And there are always a few academics in these committees. So far, we don't know what's going to happen in future. And they work, nobody pays us. We spend hours and hours and hours doing this work. Committees and subcommittees are formed to create this thing, discuss these questionnaires, create that. And then finally, are we going to see it in the light of day or not? I'm not sure. So a lot of work is going on. So it's no way one should, think or, suggest that, national statistics are not worth it.
Thank you, Jeemol. That was a great answer. We have questions that are just adding up in the question answer box. So let me quickly turn them around to some of the people they're addressed to. There is a question from Sania Sarin, who says that Rukmini and Diva mentioned an ideal set of questions that ask about counterfactuals. For example, what would you do if you have accessible, affordable childcare? But how would you ask these questions in a way that can prevent social desirability bias? So Diva and Rukmini. You want to take it?
Diva, should I give it a shot and then you could jump into? I think, we have examples of this sort of question being asked and answered quite successfully from other areas of social science. So we see it, for example, in voter motivation surveys, where, the question can be asked in multiple fashions through lists examples, for example, where you can sort of arrive at this. So I suppose creativity in the style of questioning would be one of the ways to go about it. And additionally, I just do want to make the point that getting past social desirability bias is sort of 101 for many key surveys. This would, it starts from how is the NFHS able to ask people about, how is the NFHS able to talk to women about their sex lives, about sexual violence. So there is an, sort of underlying level of training that shouldn't be discounted as well. Diva?
No, thanks, Rukmini, for adding that. I think, to my mind, of course, there are ways to counter social desirability biases in these surveys, whether it's list randomization or using vignettes or scenarios to choose, or even asking questions like the NSS does of, would you work if you were, part-time, if that, if it were possible, and so on. So there are such possibilities, but I do think the best way to do this is to actually test it out. I mean, you can test these things out experimentally, and, would you work if there's childcare? There are a number of evaluations showing that when childcare is provided, maternal employment does increase. There may not be enough of these studies, and we may need more, not only in India, but other countries as well. But, we do get a sense of this is how much increase can happen in women's work, in GDP contribution, in other facets of household and community life if you get something like childcare. And I do think that the sort of capturing of this data of experimental, quasi-experimental programs that show the what if is very useful in understanding the state of the world when these programs are made possible.
Thank you, Diva. I was really struck when Rukmini was speaking by the field that I know better, which is fertility preferences. And I sort of wondered, when you ask people about how many children would you have wanted to have when your 3 children are running around, and would you ever be able to say that I really wanted one? Okay. Turning to another question from Ratna Sudarshan. My question is whether collecting data on what if counterfactual data might require broadening research methodology towards including case studies, qualitative data, and whether uncertainty as to how acceptable this might be to economists and statisticians and statistics, which acts as sort of a restraining force. Okay, so any of you want to take it, whether the world of statistics is willing to accept qualitative methodology as something that's legitimate? Jeemol, do you want to take a shot at this?
Yes, Ratna, I totally agree with you. So why do you worry about the economists? If they are not, you see, the economists are going into, more and more. In fact, we have struggles among the economists also. Unless and until you do a DID, unless and until you do a randomized control trial, you can't tell anything, and so on and so forth. So that's going to be there. And these are all fashions and fads. I keep telling my students, because they're also now fascinated with this behavioral and randomized trial kind of experiments. And anything and everything can be solved through an experiment. So these are fads and fashions. And I think qualitative data has a huge, because you see, when we look at secondary data, which I use a lot, then I do collect data, but not in terms of, focus group discussions and things like that. Not because I don't believe in it, simply because I am not trained in that methodology. I would need somebody else to help me with that. But to be able to explain what I am seeing in my data, in my secondary data aggregate thing, I need that information coming from these focus group discussions and qualitative. And in fact, the reason why I'm able to explain a few things that I do see in the data is because I spend my time reading all that stuff. So it's not like it's not important, and it's not like economists are that important for number one, and number two, all economists are not the same. So Ratna, I think the work that you people do in terms of qualitative data, focus group discussions and all that are terrific. And it really tells us, it helps us to explain what you are seeing from all this other macro data that you're seeing. Because otherwise I see a lot of people who do these experiments and they just say that, they come up with this, they have no clue. They have no clue what's happening in this world or in the society that they're talking to. And that really comes if you spend your time reading up all this material, which is, I'm not an expert in that, but then I read the people who are experts in it.
Indira Hirve has a couple of comments on time use data. Yeah. Mayra, did you want to respond to this? Please do.
Thank you. No, I just was going to say that, I have seen incredible progress in researchers being able to work with both sets of data. And funnily enough, I mean, the advent of the randomized control trials, and so many researchers are now using the randomized control trials as a big methodology, but that in itself has pointed out how there are limits to what you can do with a randomized control trial. And I think that now I have the sense that there's a lot more acceptance that to truly, sort of understand the world and reality and women, you need the quantitative data, you need the randomized control trials that are going to say something about causality, but you also need the qualitative data to understand the mechanisms and to pose the right questions to ask of randomized control trials. Thank you.
Let me just chime in here. When we started talking about randomized control trials, it has struck me that from gender perspective, there are some really interesting challenges to randomized control trials, because there is an assumption often that the behavioral structures are similar across different areas, and the trial that worked in one area would work somewhere else. And yet social norms, particularly gender norms, vary tremendously. So whatever other challenges randomized control trials might have in terms of generalizability, from a gender perspective, there is an added challenge that we probably would need to think about. To return to the questions that we have very fast piling on, there are two comments from Indira Hirve, and I actually want you to respond to it, Diva, because I think you answered one of it in the box that other people can't see. Indira Hirve mentioned that time use data can help resolve some of the challenges of measuring women's labor force participation. She also noted that there are a lot of experimentation that is happening in terms of reducing the cost of time use surveys, because one thing, time use surveys get discounted because they are just seen to be too expensive. Okay, and she mentioned some of the experimentation, and I think Diva responded to it in the chat box. Would you like to respond to it on the forum?
I mean, I think just to jump in and say that, I agree with Indira. Time use surveys are crucial to actually understanding how women are spending time, what unpaid care work looks like. And I think it's heartening to see that there's a growing recognition of this within sort of governments, as well as movements who have obviously seen this, been clamoring for this data for decades at this point. But for example, at the Generation Equality Forum, time use data has become a key part of the commitments from the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition. So it's a centerpiece of the data work that needs to be collected. And I don't know if it's the pandemic, I don't know if it's success of the sort of advocacy that has been happening for decades, but there's a sudden spurt in demand for technical assistance from governments in actually doing time use data. So UN Women told me a couple of months ago that they had received 70 plus requests from countries on collecting time use data and surveys. But these are extremely expensive, and it's not a tool that you can often use on a regular basis. So I do like the fact that there are innovations that are happening in this space. So the ILO, for example, is developing a light time use module. And I know Mayra, for example, has also worked on this with them on actually conceptualizing what that could look like in terms of layering it into a labor force survey. So not having a standalone expensive time use survey, but actually integrating it into existing surveys. I also think that there's so many people on the panel today or on this call who are doing these kinds of innovations, whether it's light questions in questionnaires or thinking about visual representations, pictorial representations of time use to capture data, and or using necklace cameras. I know if we did that as well, of actually trying to capture it, by just wearing it around your neck and photographing what your day looks like. I think there are a number of interesting experiments happening in this space. The one thing I do want to add on time use, just because we're here, is a few years ago, I'd gone to temples in Odisha to actually see how they were depicting time use around circles. So they depict sort of time use for men and women in these temple sculptures by looking around sort of how women spend their day in sort of these beautiful molded stone forms. And I think it's something that we have tried to do over a long time. And so it's important that we sort of continue pushing the boundaries on time use innovations. So agree with Indira on that.
There are several fascinating questions from Harsha Krishna, and I'll try to get to them. But there is the last one that I'm also very curious about. So I decided to sort of push it forward, and I'd like to address it to Rukmini. Do the panelists think that some of the data advocacy for gender has to be separated from the traditional women and child development lens that has been used to truly separate the notion of care work and women?
Well, yes and no, I would say. Partly because, yes, as all the panelists have pointed out, the highly fragmented nature of the paid work that women do and are increasingly doing, as well as the fact that, from your own examples as well, women respondents sometimes do not even accurately identify work as being paid or productive. So all of that would make sense to sort of remove it from a women and child perspective. But, one of the things, just in terms of sort of rational behavior, looking at, multiple data sets for the book, I was also struck by, the sort of dominance of marriage and children in the lives of women. The fact that, thinking even about social norms in terms of paid work becomes so essential in terms of thinking of it within the structure of marriage because of how universal marriage is in India, and the fact that tending to household responsibilities and childcare is overwhelmingly the answer given by women to the question of why they aren't at work. So I suppose my answer is a bit of yes and no. I don't think that it is an entirely separate space, but perhaps we need to be having better conversations in communicating to women respondents about what even makes up productive work, which would potentially help in more useful responses. I'm sure there are others on. I mean, you directed this to me, but I'm sure there are other panelists with better answers to this.
Anybody else wants to take it? Okay, I think I guess I'll just I'll respond to this with an anecdote. This was a question you have heard asked when there are data being collected on gender-based violence. Why is this question often only being asked to women, and why don't we ask it of men? And does it mean that men are also not subject to violence? And yes, they may be. But at least the data that we seem to have overwhelmingly seems to note that women are more likely to be subject to gender-based violence. And the time use data that we do have seems to suggest that women are overwhelmingly more likely to be providing care work. So trying to sort of equalize might be actually lead to more inequalities. Okay, so there are several other very interesting questions that I'd like to get to. One is from Professor Dr. Gurcharan Manna, which is directed at Jeemol Unni. Professor Unni, what is the view of Standing Committee on Economic Statistics regarding implementation of some of the 19th SCLS recommendations, particularly regarding capturing of different forms of work?
Manna, I think you'll have to help us with that, since you're on the Economic Statistics Committee as well, right? So when we take this to the committee, I suppose you're going to support it. So this work has been done within the subcommittee, and the subcommittee would be taking this over to the main committee. So, well, it's up to all of us to see whether this can be done. And I think it's an interesting way of trying to expand this concept of work, and to be able to, many of the questions which are being asked by feminist economists and others can be seen that. So, Manna, I don't have the answer to that. We have a questionnaire for sure, and it does capture quite a lot of the forms of work. Now, whether it will come through or not is a different story.
For my colleagues who are out of the internal statistical discussion, just so you know, Dr. Gurcharan Manna is on the National Statistical Commission. So this has to be a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek question directed at Jeemol Unni. Okay, we have some other very interesting questions. One is from Varya Lipovsek, and she asks, could the panelists reflect a bit more on the incentives to actually use gender data in influencing the design of policies and programs, especially government? Technically, good quality data is, of course, a prerequisite, but what incentivizes those in the power who often do not hold feminist views to pay attention? What can researchers do differently? Thank you. Varya is from Co-Impact. Thank you. Anyone would like to take that? Again, Rukmini, do you want to sort of start, and then we'll pass it on to, I think, Mayra, who has worked a lot in this area.
I would actually suggest that, and I will start by admitting that I have a very purely Indian perspective, and suspect that this is different for different countries. But I do feel that in the last few years there has been a shift in public conversation to the point that it isn't very, it isn't a hard sell to make these seem important to policymakers. And the sort of underlying assumption that they would not hold these feminist principles doesn't often ring true. I do think that that accepting that that official data is missing things which might require separate work is a harder ask to do. So, for example, just accepting that data collected by the government's own left hand around from the national sample around access to health and around spending decisions within household on health for men versus women is not something that feeds into public policy and hasn't fed into public policy during the pandemic. So getting these issues seen as crucial and urgent is perhaps a bigger challenge, but I don't think that the underlying issue of making gender data seem important or sort of imperative to governments. I think we've come some distance on that.
Let me say that I think Rukmini has actually probably contributed tremendously to it through some of her columns. Journalists, I think, have an immense role to play in getting the data to the public and getting attention to it in the government. Next, I'd like to turn to Mayra to answer the same question. Mayra, what will get gender data used and heard?
Yeah, I think this is an incredibly important question, and I think that we, increasingly are seeing that there is a lot of gender data available, but it's not being used, as we have already said. Sort of data is used if the data is generated by the line ministry, it usually gets used by the line ministry in policy, right? So if the health ministry does a health questionnaire, then it's much more likely that the health ministry will use that health questionnaire to design policy. The problem, and I think is the problem is related that gender is a cross-cutting area, and that we need to oftentimes influence, ministries that are different from the ones where the data has been generated. And that, I think, is where data coalitions and international coalitions and platforms are incredibly important. And, just talking from Data to X and Data to X, we are a platform. The idea of being the first and the very obvious idea of bringing data producers together with data users. I mean, so sort of fostering the conversation between those who produce data and those who use the data, the user and the policymaker is first a priority thing to do, and I think is most of the time not done. So I think that is a first one. A second one, and I want to sort of pick up an issue that we have yet to talk about, is harmonizing data. And there are a number of different data producers, particularly in the international arena, international data producers that produce similar data, ask the same questions, but in slightly different ways, and the data is not harmonized. And this ends up, I think, costing tremendously to governments that then, have the ILO saying something about sort of labor force participation, that the World Bank with their household surveys say something different. And I think that there's one of the really interesting things that Data 2X has been doing, and with the support of the Gates Foundation. And I think Gates obviously has been just brilliant in terms of the kind of support that they're giving to gender data, is bringing these different data producers together. And we have brought together the ILO and the World Bank sort of over a set of questions on women's economic participation in agriculture to try to get them to ask the question in the same way, to harmonize the responses, and even if they're not asking them in the same way, to realize what they're doing well and what they're doing different. So I think data harmonization is really important, and it's sort of the way to go, hopefully in the future, particularly for the international data producers. So I may not have answered the question, but I think that it's really important that we try to incentivize data producers to start asking questions the same way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayra. I think that the one line in your response that I will always stay with me is that somehow we need to have better conversation between data producers and data users. I think that's probably going to be the tagline of this discussion. We do have a very interesting question from Priya Nanda, and I'm going to throw that one at Diva. Data is stories that are being told, and absence of data is stories untold. But our program and policies do not measure up to even the data that is available. Do you agree that we need to strike a balance between what is available and what is not? Do we need more data on how to incentivize women to work? Or do we need better policies and programs for women's work?
Thanks, Sonal. And I think this also builds on the last question. So I think I'll take a stab at actually answering some of those questions around what do we need, how do we use it. I think what's most important is not only, as people have said here before, is data is often available, but not actually used and taken up. And so it's not only about bringing users and producers together to create data that is actually responsive and filling a policy need, but it's also work that others are doing, including journalists like Rukmini, on the so what, and actually trying to understand what implications do the findings from data actually have for policy. There's also a role in actually bridging what you're seeing, often very complex patterns in the data, to how that actually links up to where changes can be made. So just to give an example, taking the same theme around care that we've been discussing, when you have your time use data and you realize that there's disproportionate amount of work, for example, unpaid care work that women are doing, and there's growing recognition of this, then so what next from there? So increasingly, I think efforts that are being taken by data producers to work much more closely with nonprofits, researchers, stakeholders, governments on actually using that data from time use surveys, but also other evaluations of programs to actually help shape new policies. So Kenya, for example, is using its first time use survey to actually think about how to shape their national care policy and think about what kinds of roadmaps are needed in different parts of the government to address the care issue more holistically. And so agree that it's about production and use, but it's also really about creating that bridging conversation for bi-directional engagement between producers and users to actually tell that story better. So it's not that it's captured in a data, but it's actually told in a way that is easy to use and apply in various policies and programs.
Thank you, Diva. Pallavi has been following some of the questions, so I'm going to turn over the mic to her to ask.
This is a question from Kuala Zainab. And the question is, what is the potential of e-Shram registration of informal workers in India in capturing the details of Indian economy? Now, I would like the panelists to reflect a bit also on when we talk about informal economy, not just the firm-based workers, like workers in firms, whether in formal sector or in the formal sector, but also women's participation in family farms, which often don't get captured because of social norms of like what is considered as work and what is not considered as work. So can you reflect that in terms of like, the e-Shram registration and where we are headed? And the second aspect I would like you to reflect on is the gig economy and what role e-Shram has to play in this aspect, especially when we think of social protection measures. So who will take this first? Maybe Professor Unni, and followed by Mayra and the others.
See, e-Shram and the registration of informal workers and migrant workers and so on is a very, very interesting activity which is going on. And when you try, I can't make out anything, because when I try to open that site, it doesn't give us any data. So I can register myself as a migrant worker there or as some other kind of worker. but I can't actually see what is it that they're asking of these workers. So to that extent, I'm pretty clueless as to what it is. If somebody else has information, maybe they can tell us. Maybe you can tell us who asked this question. But yes, it is. See, the problem is the same as a registration of every other kind of workers, like the construction workers, or then there was the Social Protection Act, which Social Security Act, which happened in 2008, and then we had another act and so on. The number of workers who actually register for that, that itself requires a tremendous amount of activity by, say, NGOs or trade unions or other people, where you explain to the workers the advantages of registering for that, provided that there are some advantages of registering for that. Otherwise, it's not, it's not a complete record of either migrants or of informal workers or anything like that. So exactly what is the purpose of this e-Shram is not that clear to me. But then at the same time, I have also been arguing, see, we don't have a record of the skills that people have. Okay, we know that there are these thousands of informal workers, and they seem to be working in construction, or they seem to be working in domestic work or something. But what on earth do they have by way of a skill? So some kind of a recording of these skills, there are a number of private platforms which are doing this. And there's one in Ahmedabad as well. And in fact, I work with them. It's a private company. They were trying to do it first for blue collar workers in industrial estates within the city. And now they're trying to do it for construction workers. And sometimes my students take projects which help them to do that. Then there is LaborNet, and there is other organizations which are collecting this kind of information about the skill. Not that Naukri.com and all that. They don't actually record the skills. They just put these people together, and then they have no record of what happened in terms of transactions. So e-Shram is I'm sure a good effort, but I have no clue unless I can see what it is that they are actually, what information they're actually collecting, and is that available to anybody to be able to get a sense of the informal economy. I hope that was your question.
Thank you. I think as we are approaching the end of this discussion, there are a few things that I would like to highlight instead of turning to other panelists for response. It seems to me that we are living in times which are changing very, very fast. Some of the changes that we are facing have to do with, Pallavi mentioned sort of a gig economy and transformation of workforce. The labor force that we work in is transforming rapidly before our eyes. The pandemic has led to a transformation of the mode by which we work from home. Home-based workers who used to be disadvantaged are now actually some of the more advantaged group of workers who are working from home. So there is a transformation of the workforce, and which has a gendered nature attached to it. There is also a transformation in the way we collect data and the type of data that we use. Okay, we have all been talking about survey data because at the most census or labor force data that we are all used to. But then some of the new modes of data collection, such as mobility data, Facebook survey data, online data scraping, also has a gendered aspect to it, which we haven't paid much attention to. Some of my colleagues at NCER have been working with Facebook data, and they find that the Facebook respondents are disproportionately male. Okay. Now, as we sort of start looking at some of these different forms of data, ensuring that there is a appropriate gendered representation into it is also going to be important. So I don't think in today's webinar, we are coming to conclusion on many of these issues that have been raised, but it is our goal at the Gender Data Hub at NCER to be dealing with some of these issues, raising them, debating them, discussing them, evaluating them as we go along over the years. And we hope that it will serve the cause of advocacy for the reduction in gender inequality, better lives for men, women, children, trans men, trans women, a variety of segments of our society. And not to forget inequalities in that by other dimensions such as caste, class, and race. So thank you very much. Thank you to today's panelists for this wonderful discussion. Thank you, Rukmini, Diva, Mayra, Jeemol, and Pallavi. This has been a great conversation, and I look forward to more such conversations. Thank you. Thank you to our audience for staying up so late here in New Delhi. Thanks.
Thank you to you, Sonal, for organizing this.
Thank you, Sonal.
Thank you to everyone, and congrats on launching the Gender Data Hub.
And happy Women's Day to everyone. Thank you.